There are places in this world that feel untouched by time, places that don't follow the rules of reality as we know them. Some people call them liminal spaces, the kind that make you feel like you've stepped into another era, or maybe even another world entirely. But this diner, this place was something else entirely. The Devil's Fork Diner sat on the edge of nowhere, nestled between two old highways that hadn't seen a gas station in miles. No neon signs, no billboards, just a dusty old structure, sitting at a crossroads where lost travelers sometimes found themselves, though never intentionally. It wasn't on any map. It had no online presence, no Google reviews, no website. But word still got around. Truckers, drifters, hitchhikers, and desperate souls whispered about it in late-night conversations. Ever hear about that diner in Louisiana? Yeah, the one where you don't pay for your meal. That's the one. But you do pay, just not with money. The rumors varied depending on who told them. Some claimed it was a ghost story, a local legend that truckers told to spook each other on long-haul routes. Others swore they had been there themselves, that they had eaten the best meal of their lives inside, but that the experience left them changed in a way they couldn't explain. And a few said they knew someone who went in and never came out. If you somehow found the diner, if you were unlucky enough to stumble upon it, you'd be greeted by a woman named Mabel Grant. Mabel was not a woman you forgot. She was tall, with a presence that commanded attention the moment you stepped inside. Her graying hair was always tied up in a loose bun, a stained apron wrapped around her waist, and a cigarette perpetually burning between her fingers. She had a way of looking right through you, like she already knew what you were about to say before you even opened your mouth. Her voice was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of someone who had heard far too many secrets. "Take a seat, honey. It's late. You look hungry." Her eyes would flick toward the empty booths, as if she already knew where you were supposed to sit. And the menu? There was no menu. She simply knew what you needed. A lonely widow passing through on her way to a funeral might find a hot bowl of chicken and dumplings in front of her before she even ordered. A runaway kid, starving and desperate, might be served a plate of crispy fried chicken and told, "Eat up, sugar." And a man with too many secrets? A man on the run from something he couldn't explain? Well, he'd get coffee. Black, bitter, the kind that made you stay awake. The first thing you needed to know about the Devil's Fork Diner was that money was useless here. Mabel never took cash. No matter how much you had, no matter how hungry you were, there was only one way to pay for your meal. You had to tell her a story, a real one, a secret you'd never told another soul. "Tell me something true," she'd say, leaning on the counter, wiping her hands on a rag that never seemed to get clean. Something you've buried so deep inside, you almost forgot it yourself. That was the deal. Tell her your story, and your meal was on the house. Lie, and something terrible would happen. No one knew exactly what, but the few people who had tried to fake their way through it, those who thought they could make something up or twist the truth, were never seen again. Some say Mabel had a way of knowing, that she could see when you were lying, like your soul flickered differently under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the diner. Others believed it wasn't her you had to worry about, that the diner itself could tell when someone was cheating the deal, that something in the walls, in the floors, in the very air you breathed would know if you weren't playing fair. And once you crossed that line, you didn't leave. Not in the way you came, anyway. There was a pattern to the stories surrounding the Devil's Fork Diner. Most people who found the place, they left with a full belly and a strange sense of unease. They couldn't quite explain it, but something about the experience lingered, like a shadow following them home, a whisper in the back of their mind. But some people never made it out. Truckers swapping stories in smoky roadside bars would shake their heads and mutter about a guy who went in and never came back out. A drifter named Jimmy was last seen walking into the diner. A woman on a cross-country road trip texted her sister that she'd found the cutest little place and would call after dinner. She never called. Their cars were found abandoned on the roadside, still packed with their belongings. Keys still in the ignition. It was like they had simply vanished. No struggle. No signs of foul play. Just gone. Some people whispered that the Devil's Fork Diner wasn't really a diner at all. That was something else. Something older. Something that had existed for centuries, hiding in plain sight, waiting for lost souls to stumble in. There were theories. Some said it was a pocket of reality that had come loose, a place that sat between our world and another. Others believed Mabel wasn't human, that she was a collector of stories, feeding on the confessions of those who entered. And the darkest theory of them all, that if you told her a secret bad enough, the diner would take you, not as punishment, but because some stories change a person so deeply that the world doesn't want them back. For decades, the Devil's Fort Diner remained exactly the same, until the night a man named Caleb Boone walked in. A man who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. A man whose secret was never meant to be spoken aloud. And when he told his story, the diner decided to collect. That night, everything changed. The night Caleb Boone walked into the Devil's Fork Diner, the air was thick with humidity, the kind that made your clothes cling to your skin and your lungs feel heavy. The kind that signaled a storm brewing somewhere in the distance, even if the sky overhead was still clear. A full moon hung high above the cracked asphalt of the forgotten highway, casting pale light on the gravel parking lot. It wasn't much of a lot, just enough space for a handful of cars, though tonight, only one was there. A rusted-out pickup truck, the kind that had seen better days. The neon sign above the diner's entrance flickered, buzzing softly like it was struggling to stay alive. It spelled out one word, the only word it ever needed. Open. The glass door swung inward with a creak, the little brass bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the air smelled of black coffee, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The moment Caleb stepped inside, Mabel knew. She knew before he said a word. This man wasn't here by chance. Caleb Boone looked hollowed out. His face was gaunt, his skin slick with sweat despite the cool air inside. Dark circles ringed his bloodshot eyes, and his clothes, jeans, boots, and a jacket that had seen too many miles, were damp with either sweat or something worse. He had the look of a man who had been running from something. Or maybe something had been running after him. Mabel didn't react. She had seen all kinds of people come through her doors. She let them believe they had found the diner by accident. She let them think it was just another roadside joint, a quiet spot for tired travelers looking for a meal. But the truth? The diner found them. And tonight, it found Caleb Boone. Mabel didn't ask him what he wanted. She didn't need to. She simply nodded toward the empty booths. Go on, take a seat, honey. Caleb hesitated, his gaze flicking to the old clock above the counter. The second hand moved too slowly, as if time itself was reluctant to move forward inside this place. But he obeyed. He slid into the booth farthest from the door, where the lighting was dim and the window showed nothing but pitch-black darkness, as if the world outside had simply stopped existing. Mabel took her time. She poured a fresh cup of coffee, black and steaming, and slid in front of him. She didn't ask what he was running from, didn't pry. She just gave him that look, the kind that made people talk even when they didn't want to. Caleb stared into the coffee like it held answers. His hands were shaking as he lifted the cup, taking a slow sip. Then, finally, he spoke. How does this place work? Mabel wiped her hands on the rag tucked into her apron. You tell me a story, she said simply. Something true. Something you ain't never told another soul. You do that. And your meal's on the house. Caleb exhaled, shaking his head. What happens if I lie? Mabel didn't blink. You don't want to find out. The neon light flickered overhead. And Caleb Boone? He started talking. I used to work for a man named Ellis Price, Caleb began, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. You ever hear that name? Mabel shook her head, though deep down, she knew it didn't matter. Didn't think so. He's not the kind of man who likes to be known. Caleb took another sip of coffee, staring at something unseen beyond the diner walls. Ellis ran things out in Texas. Not drugs, not guns, something worse. Something you don't talk about in daylight. And I was real good at making problems disappear. A silence settled over the diner. Not just quiet, a silence that felt intentional. Even the old ceiling fan, which had been lazily turning for decades, slowed. Mabel listened, because that's what she did. One night, Ellis calls me up, Caleb continued. Tells me I need to take care of a loose end. Some guy. Nobody important. Just a name in a file. But when I got to the place, he was already gone. He swallowed hard. His fingers drummed against the coffee cup. Only thing left was a note. It had my name on it. Mabel raised an eyebrow. What did it say? Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. It said, I see you. The next few nights, Caleb started seeing things. A figure in the distance, always just out of reach. Standing by gas stations. Watching from motel parking lots. Never moving. Never blinking. Just waiting. He drove faster. Took different highways. Burned through 3 burner phones. But no matter where he went, it was always there. A man in a black suit. Face pale as bone. Eyes like something that had been buried too long underground. And the worst part? No one else could see him. Caleb whispered. Even when he was standing right there. I'd tell someone, look, right there. And they just stare at me like I was crazy. Like I was talking to nothing. Mabel let out a slow breath. And what did you do? Caleb chuckled, but there was no humor in it. I ran. I kept running. Until I found this place. He looked up at Mabel, desperate now. Tell me something, he said, his voice raw. Have you ever heard of something like that before? Mabel tilted her head. Doesn't matter what I've heard. The lights flickered again, and outside the diner window, a figure stood in the darkness, unmoving, watching, waiting. Mabel sighed, shaking her head. You should have kept that story to yourself, honey. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. What? Mabel gestured toward the window. Caleb turned, and his blood ran cold. It was inside, standing by the door. The man in black. Only now he was smiling. Wide. Too wide. Teeth like rows of needles. Oh, Caleb, the thing whispered, stepping forward. You finally told someone. Caleb scrambled to his feet. His chair crashed to the floor. His hands dug into his jacket, reaching for something. Maybe a knife. Maybe a gun, but it was already too late. Mabel didn't move. She just watched, because some debts had to be paid. And tonight, Caleb Boone was the payment. Caleb Boone should have kept his mouth shut. The moment those words left his lips, the air in the diner changed. The scent of coffee and warm food that lingered in the air curdled. The buzzing of the neon sign outside took on a sinister undertone, like the hum of a distant wasp nest. And Mabel? She sighed like someone who had just seen a car wreck happen in slow motion. One she could do nothing to stop. Ah, Caleb, she muttered under her breath. You were doing so well. Caleb's stomach reeled. What? What do you mean? But Mabel wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had shifted toward the door. And that's when Caleb felt it. That creeping, ice-cold sensation of being watched. Of something standing just behind him, too close. And when he turned, it was there. For weeks, Caleb had only seen it from a distance. A shadow at the edge of a gas station parking lot. A figure standing just outside the glow of a street lamp. A face reflected in a window where there should have been no one. But now was inside, and there was nothing between them. The man in black stood just beyond the diner's entrance. He was tall, too tall. His suit was pitch black, absorbing the dim light like a hole in reality itself. His skin was pale. Not just pale, but wrong, like a wax figure left too close to a fire. And his smile. God, the smile. It stretched too wide across his face, splitting his cheeks in a way that flesh shouldn't move. He took a slow step forward, the scuffed linoleum creaking beneath his polished black shoes. And when he spoke, his voice was Caleb's own. You shouldn't have told her, Caleb. Time itself seemed to stall. The second hand on the old clock behind the counter froze, locked in place. The hum of the ceiling fan stilled. The neon sign's flickering buzz cut out completely. Even the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lean in, watching. Mabel remained seated behind the counter, her fingers lazily tapping against the worn formica surface. She didn't move, didn't speak. This wasn't her fight. This was Caleb's debt to pay. And he knew it. Caleb's heartbeat thundered in his chest. His mouth was dry, his hands clammy. He took an instinctive step back, his boots scraping against the checkered tile. What do you want? His voice cracked. The thing in the black suit tilted its head. It was subtle, just a fraction of an inch. But Caleb could feel it. It was studying him. You already know, it whispered in his voice. And Caleb did. He knew exactly why it was here. Because the moment he spoke his secret out loud, it owned him. Caleb had thought that saying it aloud, telling Mabel the truth, would lessen the burden, that it would break the curse, that it would free him from whatever had been stalking him through every sleepless night and every back road he had taken to escape. But the rules were never that simple. The story wasn't his to tell. And now, the thing in the black suit had come to collect. You shouldn't have run, it murmured, voice still eerily calm. You should have accepted what was coming. But instead, it took another step forward. You brought her into it. Its gaze flicked to Mabel for the first time. And that was when Caleb realized his mistake. For decades, the Devil's Fork Diner had been a place where travelers paid with their secrets. Mabel had listened to countless confessions, some harmless, some horrifying, some that even made the walls shudder. But she had never interfered, because the diner was neutral ground. Until now, Caleb had broken the balance. And by speaking his secret aloud inside these walls, he had changed something fundamental. Now, the rules no longer protected him. And maybe they no longer protected Mabel either. The man in black took another step forward. And this time, Caleb felt it. A pressure, like the weight of the entire diner was pushing in on him. Like gravity itself had turned against him. The fluorescent lights above flickered again. But this time, they didn't come back on. Darkness swallowed the room. And Caleb felt his breath stop. Something had wrapped around his throat. Not hands. Not something human. But something cold. Something that slithered. Something that wanted to pull him into the dark. Wait. Caleb gasped. Please. The man in black smiled wider. You belong to us now. And the last thing Caleb Boone saw was his own reflection in those pitch-black eyes. And then, he was gone. The light snapped back on. The second hand on the clock resumed ticking. The ceiling fan groaned to life, stirring the stagnant air. And the man in black? He was gone too. Only the faint smell of burnt matches remained in the air. Mabel exhaled, slow and measured, like someone finishing a long shift at work. She reached for the coffee pot, poured herself a fresh cup, and took a long sip. Then she walked over to Caleb's abandoned booth, pulled a rag from her apron pocket, and wiped down the seat. Like he had never been there at all. Because in the end, maybe he never was. Outside, the neon open sign flickered back to life. The highway stretched on, leading to places people would rather forget. And somewhere, sometime, another traveler would take a wrong turn, would stumble into the diner's warm glow, unaware of the rules they had just stepped into. They'd sit at a booth. They'd meet Mabel. They'd be told the price of a meal. And maybe, just maybe, they'd tell a story they were never meant to share. And if they did, well, the diner always collects. The diner was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Mabel stood at the counter, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, staring at the now empty booth where Caleb Boone had sat just minutes ago. He was gone. No body, no blood, no sign that he had ever been there at all. And yet, Mabel knew better. She had seen it happen before. She had seen what happens when a person tells a story they were never meant to tell. She sighed, took a slow sip of her coffee, and turned toward the empty diner. Outside, the neon open sign flickered. The diner still stood, and the road outside still stretched into the distance. But something was different. Something had shifted. For as long as she had run this place, the Devil's Fork Diner had been simply a place where strangers confessed their sins. A place that found people who needed to talk. A place that took secrets as payment and let people walk away with a full belly and a little less weight on their souls. And for years, the diner had stayed neutral. It didn't judge. It didn't punish. It just existed. But tonight felt wrong. The thing in the black suit, the thing that took Caleb Boone, was something Mabel had never seen before. Something that shouldn't have been able to step foot inside these walls. Because the diner had rules. And the biggest rule of all, nothing could come in unless it was invited. But this thing, it had waltzed in like it owned the place. And that scared her. Mabel walked into the back of the diner, past the kitchen, past the storage rooms, past the places where normal diners kept their normal things. And she stopped at a heavy wooden door, one that didn't quite fit with the rest of the building. It wasn't the same color as the walls. It wasn't the same age. It was older. Much, much older. She reached in her apron pocket, pulled out a tarnished silver key, and turned the lock. The door swung open, revealing a room that did not belong in a diner. Inside, the air was heavy. Dust floated in thin golden beams of light that came from no clear source. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with journals, ledgers, and strange little trinkets that hummed with energy. And at the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, sat the ledger, a massive, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Mabel stepped forward, her fingers tracing the edge of the book. She hadn't opened it in years, not since the last time something had gone wrong. She took a breath, placed her palm against the cover, and flipped it open. The ledger was how she kept track. Every person who had ever stepped into the Devil's Fork Diner, every secret that had ever been spoken within these walls, and every person who had paid the price for telling the wrong story. She flipped through the pages, scanning names written in ink that had long since dried. Some were crossed out. Some had notes beside them. Some had no ending. And then, finally, she reached the last name in the book. Caleb Boone. The ink was still fresh, smudged at the edges, as if reality itself had hesitated to let it dry. And beneath his name, written in a script that was not her own, were the words, "Collected." Mabel's lips pressed into a thin line. That was not how it was supposed to work. The diner took stories. It did not take people. And yet, Caleb Boone was gone, erased like he had never been here, like he had never existed at all. She ran her fingers across the word, "collected," feeling the raised edges of the ink, the way it had been written with purpose. And then she flipped back through the pages, scanning for other names with that same mark. There weren't many, but they were there, scattered throughout the years, some dozens of years apart, some much closer together. And the most recent one, just before Caleb Boone, it was from 2 weeks ago. Mabel's breath stopped. She stared at the name. She recognized it, because the man had sat in the very same booth Caleb had spoken his secret just the same, and then had vanished just the same. Mabel closed the ledger. Her hands were shaking. For the first time in years, she felt something she wasn't used to feeling in her own diner. Uncertainty. She had thought she understood this place. She had thought she knew the rules. But something had changed. The diner was no longer just listening. It was taking. And the question that burned in her mind was this. Was it choosing who to take? Or was something else, something worse, making that choice? Outside, a car engine rumbled. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked pavement. A traveler, lost on the road, just like always, just like Caleb Boone. Mabel inhaled slowly, steadying herself as she walked back to the front of the diner. She reached the counter just as the door creaked open, the little bell jingling overhead. A man stepped inside, tall, tired-looking, the kind of man who had seen too much, carried too many burdens, the kind of man with a story to tell. Mabel put on her best practice smile, nodding toward the empty booths. "Go on, take a seat, honey." The man hesitated, glanced around like he was looking for something wrong. Then, slowly, he made his way to the very same booth Caleb had occupied. Mabel poured him a cup of coffee, sliding it in front of him before he could even order. And then she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter. "Tell me something about yourself," she said softly. "Something you've never told another soul." The man exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. And then he started talking. Mabel listened, because that's what she did. She listened. She remembered. And she waited, because sooner or later, the diner would take again. And when it did, she needed to be ready. The stranger settled into the booth, rubbing his hands together as if to shake off the chill from the outside air. Mabel watched him carefully. She had learned to read people the moment they walked in. Some were just lost travelers looking for coffee and a slice of pie before heading back on the road. Others had nowhere else to go. This man, he was the second kind. His jacket was worn, frayed at the edges. His boots were thick with road dust, the kind that took days to accumulate. His face was lined, not from age, but from something else. Regret, fear, the weight of something unspoken. Mabel had seen it before, and now she was seeing it again. She poured him a cup of coffee. The sound of the steaming liquid filling the cup was the only noise in the diner. And then she slid it across the table, tilting her head. "Go on, honey," she said softly. "Tell me something true you never told anyone before." The man exhaled, wrapping his hands around the ceramic mug as if for warmth. His fingers were trembling. "You ever do something you can't take back?" he murmured. Mabel didn't blink. "Plenty of people have," she said. The man let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I guess they have." He took a sip of his coffee, and then he started talking. "My name's Carter Lorne," he began, "and I killed a man." The diner was silent. Not just the kind of silence that came from an empty room, but the kind that listens. Carter ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening, as if he didn't want to say the next part, but knew he had no choice. "It was supposed to be an accident," he continued. "That's what I told myself, anyway. That's what I told the cops, too. But deep down, I always knew it was a lie." His fingers tapped against the coffee mug. "It happened about 10 years ago. There was this guy, Paulie McGraw. We grew up together. Same schools, same streets. He was like a brother to me. Until he wasn't." Carter sighed, shaking his head. "Somewhere along the way, Paulie got himself into some bad shit. Started running with the wrong crowd. People you don't say no to once they've got their hooks in you. And me? I try to keep my distance. But Paulie, he didn't know how to let things go." He glanced up at Mabel then, eyes dark and heavy. "Ever have someone you love turn into someone you don't recognize?" Mabel didn't answer. She didn't have to. Carter continued. "One night, Paulie comes knocking on my door. It's past midnight, and he looks like hell. Blood on his hands. Panic in his eyes. He tells me he needs a favor. A big one. Says he messed up real bad and needs a place to lie low. Just for a night." His fingers gripped the coffee mug a little tighter. I let him in. Mabel already knew how the story ended. But Carter wasn't done yet. Paulie had robbed a man that night, Carter said. Some rich bastard he thought wouldn't miss what he took. Problem was, Paulie didn't just rob him. He killed him. Shot him twice in the chest and left him bleeding out on the floor. His voice was quieter now, like he was afraid someone else might hear. I told him to get the hell out. Told him I wanted no part of it. But he wouldn't listen. Kept saying he needed me. Kept saying we were brothers. And then he said the words that sealed both our fates. Carter swallowed hard. He said, "You don't have a choice, Carter. You help me, or you die with me." Mabel knew that feeling. That creeping realization that the moment had already passed. The moment when things could have gone another way. Carter had crossed a line before he even knew he had stepped over it. "So, I helped him," he admitted. "We dumped the gun. We burned his clothes. We cleaned up the blood. And when the cops started sniffing around, I kept my mouth shut." Carter let out a shaky breath. "But the thing about guilt, it doesn't go away just because you want it to. And Paulie, he wasn't the same after that night. He started drinking more. Started getting reckless. Started looking at me like I was the only loose end left." His fingers tightened around the mug until his knuckles turned white. "So, I did what I had to do." Mabel didn't blink. "And what was that?" Carter's voice was flat. "I made sure Paulie didn't wake up the next morning." The diner was still. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly. Carter exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "I told myself I did it to survive. That it was him or me. That he would have done the same thing to me if I hadn't done it first. But the truth..." He let out a bitter chuckle. "The truth is, I don't know if he ever really planned to hurt me. Maybe he would have. Maybe not. But once I put that pillow over his face, it didn't matter anymore." Carter's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the road stretched into darkness. "I've been running ever since. And the thing is, I don't even know what I'm running from anymore. The law, Paulie's ghost, or just myself." He turned to Mabel, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Mabel tapped her nails against the counter. She had heard a lot of confessions in her time. Some are harmless. Some are tragic. And some changed everything. She could already feel it in her bones. Carter Lorne had just told a story he was never meant to tell. And somewhere, in the deep corners of the diner, something had started listening. The air felt heavier now. Thicker. The kind of heaviness that came before a storm. Mabel took a slow breath and set her coffee cup down. "Well, Carter," she said, voice even, "I guess the question is..." She leaned forward, eyes dark with something unreadable. Did you pay for that crime already? Or is the debt still waiting to be collected? Carter didn't answer, because in that moment, the lights flickered, the neon sign outside buzzed, and a new shadow appeared by the door. Waiting, watching, listening. And Carter Lorne? He wasn't leaving this diner alive. Carter felt it before he saw it. That terrible, sinking weight in his gut. The feeling of something shifting, like the air itself was folding inward, crushing the space around him. The diner had gone quiet again. Not just silent, but the kind of unnatural dead quiet where even the hum of the neon lights had faded into nothing. Outside, the world seemed to stop. No passing cars, no wind, no sound. And then, Carter saw the shadow by the door. Tall, unmoving, and waiting. Mabel exhaled through her nose, slow and measured, before leaning back against the counter. She'd seen this happen before. She'd watched men and women come into this diner, confess their sins, and think they could just walk out like nothing had changed. And most of the time, they did. But not always. You feel that, don't you? Honey, she said softly, stirring her coffee, though her eyes never left Carter. His throat was dry. What is it? He rasped. Mabel tilted her head toward the figure at the door. That, sugar? That's what happens when you tell a story that was never meant to be told. Carter swallowed, his fingers tightening around the handle of his mug like it was something solid to hold on to. I thought. He hesitated, breath shaky. I thought this was just a place to talk. Mabel sighed. Most of the time, it is, she admitted. But sometimes, the diner doesn't just listen. Sometimes it decides. Carter's stomach twisted. Decides what? Mabel set down her coffee cup, folding her hands neatly over the counter. Whether or not you get to leave. Carter's pulse pounded. Every instinct told him to run, but his body refused to move. His gaze flicked toward the dark figure, and in that instant, it took a step forward. The diner's fluorescent lights dimmed, the edges of the room pulling inward as if the walls themselves were shrinking. The air was thick now, pressing against his lungs, making it hard to breathe. He tried to speak, to say anything, but the words caught in his throat. And then, the figure took another step. Closer now. Still featureless, still wrong. Just a dark suit, impossibly tall, its face obscured like it had been cut from reality itself. It did not blink. It did not breathe. But Carter knew, in his bones, that it had come for him. I don't understand, Carter whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing pressure in the room. I told my story. I pay the price. Mabel sighed, shaking her head. No, sugar. You don't get it. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, taking her time before looking back at him. The stories people tell here, they don't just disappear. They don't get erased. They get recorded. She gestured toward the back room, the one she had just come from. They get written down, remembered, preserved. Carter barely heard her. His gaze was locked on the thing in the suit. Another step, another inch closer. The lights flickered. Then why me? Carter's voice cracked. Why now? Mabel's eyes softened. Because, sweetheart, she said, voice low and gentle, like she was telling a child a harsh truth. Some debts don't get paid with words. Some debts require something else. Carter's chest tightened, and suddenly he knew. He understood. He had helped bury a crime. He had killed a man to protect himself. And now, something had come to collect. Carter tried to stand. His legs wouldn't move. The diner felt smaller. The room tilting, the air thickening like reality itself was bending around the thing at the door. And then, it spoke, but not in its own voice. No, it used Polly's. Carter, the thing whispered. Why'd you do it, man? Carter froze. It was Polly's voice, exactly as he remembered it. The rasp of late-night cigarettes, the quiet edge of desperation. The same voice that had whispered to him all those years ago. You don't have a choice. Carter stammered. His throat was closing. The weight pressing down on him now was unbearable. I had to, he choked. The shadow moved. Had to. Polly's voice repeated, dripping with something almost amused. Or did you just want to be free? Carter squeezed his eyes shut. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. I'm sorry, he whispered. The lights flickered again. And this time, they didn't come back on. Mabel didn't watch. She never did. Some things weren't meant to be witnessed. Instead, she calmly rinsed out Carter's coffee cup, wiped down the counter, and turned the open sign to closed. The diner would open again tomorrow. But for now, it needed time to digest. The next morning, when Mabel stepped outside with her first cup of coffee, the sun was rising over the endless stretch of highway. The air smelled fresh, clean, like nothing had ever happened. Carter's car was gone. No tire tracks, no footprints, no sign that he had ever stepped inside the Devil's Fork diner. She took a slow sip, breathing in the cool morning air. And then she walked back inside. Because the diner was never empty for long. Miles away, a different traveler was already heading toward the diner. He didn't know it yet. Didn't know that he would make a wrong turn. Didn't know that, in a few short hours, he would sit at a booth, sip his coffee, and tell a story that was never meant to be spoken aloud. And when he did, the diner would listen. And if the debt was high enough, it would collect. Because some stories are never meant to be shared. Some confessions don't end with forgiveness. And, at the Devil's Fork diner, the cost of a dark secret is never cheap. Somewhere, on some long, lonely stretch of road, there's a diner that isn't on any map. You won't find it in travel guides. It won't show up on your GPS. But if you take a wrong turn on a night when the air feels too still, when the sky seems a little too dark, you might end up there anyway. And if you do, if you step inside and feel the warmth of fresh coffee, if you hear the hum of an old neon sign and the soft murmur of a jukebox playing a song you don't quite recognize, then you should ask yourself one question. Do you have a secret worth keeping? Because the Devil's Fork diner doesn't forget. It listens. It records. And sometimes, it collects. So if you ever find yourself pulling into a dusty parking lot in the middle of nowhere, if a kind-eyed woman slides a coffee in front of you before you've even ordered, and if she leans in and asks, in a voice too gentle to be threatening, "Go on, honey, tell me something true," you better be damn sure that your secret is one the diner is willing to let you walk away with. Because once you've spoken it aloud, you might never leave at all.